This is Global Order. I'm Hindul Sen Gupta. I've invited Dr. Gautam Sen, 50 years, more than 50 years in London now, and formerly of the London School of Economics, to discuss something that's making news across England, the Baroness Casey report. Now, some people who have seen Global Order before will remember that we have been tracking the story of the notorious grooming gangs in the UK and assault on young British girls, sometimes for years on end, by these terrible criminal grooming gangs. And now the Baroness Casey report has, in fact, validated everything that we have been saying and many others have been saying. All the suspicions have been confirmed, all the unsubstantiated reports have been substantiated. This is one of the biggest scandals perhaps ever in British public life. Dr. Gautam Sen is here to make sense of it all. Dr. Sen, welcome.
Thank you, Hindul.
I want to begin, Dr. Sen, by asking you your first reaction to the Baroness Casey report. You and I have been discussing this off and on in private and, of course, on Global Order. But everything we spoke of, everything that was suspected, everything that was reported, everything that was hushed up, everything that was whispered around, in fact, has starkly come true. And much more than what was discussed seems to have been true about this.
There are three issues which immediately come to mind. First is that she has said absolutely nothing which was not already known. Secondly, she has a reputation as a thorough person of integrity. And thirdly, Baroness Casey's report has prompted Keir Starmer's Labour government to do a comprehensive U-turn and agree to a national inquiry, a statutory national inquiry, which I suspect obliges people to come and give evidence. However, we don't yet know what the terms of reference will be for the inquiry, and that is of absolutely central importance. Somebody called Dominic Cummings, whom people will not know of in India, but who was the key advisor in Downing Street to Prime Minister Boris Cummings and regarded as the man who was basically running the UK during that time, has tweeted on X that terms of reference already agreed will exclude investigation of local council officials, local councillors, and the police, in which case there is, in effect, no inquiry of any significance at all.
What will this. Sorry, please go on.
In the last couple of days, I've seen a interview by some rather mere Bangladeshi origin who comes from the area where some of the biggest grooming gang scandals came to light. He is a former security expert with considerable experience with government, and he has been campaigning to publicize a grooming gang episode across the country, in fact, against great odds. And what he says really requires careful attention because it changes the nature of the debate which now needs to take place in the United Kingdom. In my opinion, and this is my opinion, there is an extraordinary echo in many parts of the United Kingdom of West Bengal and ruled by the Trinamool Congress, by which I mean these parts of the United Kingdom have enjoyed virtual de facto sovereignty, where the writ of parliament is not operational. They have been doing pretty much what they please beyond judicial scrutiny. And the details of Mia's expose leave you pretty much breathless. Let me start at the very beginning with some very cynical thoughts because I have been following this issue for some years now. The Labour government of Keir Starmer sought to bury the idea of an investigation because it implicates the Labour Party in the Midlands and the North and elsewhere.
Dr. Sen, not once, it seems. You just said that the Keir Starmer government stopped or tried to stop this report from being investigated. But in British Parliament, I believe not just once, the Labour Party has tried to stop it thrice. Is that correct?
Yes, and indeed, many news channels are playing recordings of virtually all senior Labour politicians emphatically denouncing the idea of an inquiry as something which will only serve the far right. And they have been denouncing protesters against grooming gangs as far right, in effect neo fascists, and not ordinary citizens. Now, of course, they have done a complete U turn, but the issue actually is more significant in relation to the national inquiry which has been proposed. Once again, the terms of reference are yet to be announced, and we await that. They had proposed that the national inquiry will be substituted by local government inquiries in the individual local councils, which I presume means by councillors. But these very councillors, some of them were actually individuals who were doing the grooming and raping. And all these councils, like in Oldham, Rotherham, were engaged actively and constantly in the very cover-up which the Labour Party proposed they now investigate. So the complicity of the National Labour Party leaves one aghast. There is a specific instance where a 13-year-old girl had been raped, and evidence was produced of the fetus. And yet, the Director of Public Prosecution, which was Keir Starmer at the time, did not permit a prosecution for rape. It would not have been the rape of a minor because that happens at the age of 12. But he actually, I believe, proposed that it be investigated as a conspiracy of some sort. This is the accusation being made by Raja Miah in the program which has been broadcast by Andrew Gold. And I am depending on them for the veracity of this particular assertion.
Let's talk about the Baroness Casey report and what it says. One of the things it says is that it takes forward this point of complicities that you made, that in many cases, law enforcement officials and politicians not only prevented a complaint or complaints to be made, when complaints were made, there was a court case, they tried their best to obstruct the course of justice. Even after a court judgment came, this kind of obstruction continued from local police enforcement authorities and local politicians in many cases. And this is not for 1 or 2 years, this seems to have gone on for decades. That's what the Baroness Casey report suggests.
Well, I think it was even worse than that. Raja Miah says that he was investigated and his house was raided by 8 policemen because council officials complained against him and accused him of inciting violence, which he has demonstrated to be completely fabricated because he has the original tape recordings and documents to prove it. The police are also accused of intimidating young women who were the victims of this rape. The scale of this is quite staggering. And the kinds of revelations made by the Oxford County Court, where some prosecutions have taken place and the findings have been made public, are so bad that I cannot even bear repeating most of it. Young girls were tied up and raped simultaneously in all orifices by men. And I stress the word simultaneous rape in all orifices by these Pakistani men. This is what was going on under the nose of the Labour Party, and the accusation is that the Labour Party's national leadership and regional leadership in cities like Manchester were in the know, but they were worried about votes. Now, this question of votes actually reminds me absolutely about West Bengal, absolutely, and Kerala, and other parts of India. In local elections, fewer than 30% of electors cast their votes. In effect, and this is my guesswork, many of these mosques were in touch with the Pakistani embassy officials in London and through them with Islamabad and the ISI to coordinate the seizure of British cities and boroughs, Manchester, Rotherham, Oxford, in order to exercise decisive influence over Britain and British foreign policy, which is why Britain has been, in the Parliament at least, steadfastly hostile to all things Indians. And there have been so many attempts to legislate to corner Hindus, for example, with the completely made up accusations of caste discrimination for which they have produced zero evidence. And I stress the word zero because I was involved with this campaign with the government officials from 2009, and I was told by the officials no such legislation was planned in the Equalities Act of 2010, but it was inserted by Labour and Liberal Democratic peers because much of the Tory party on that day was attending the funeral of Margaret Thatcher in Westminster. So Pakistan has indirectly shown exceptional skill through its assets in the United Kingdom to exercise extraordinary influence over British politics, and regional British politics is occurring in de facto sovereign areas, much like West Bengal, where the CBI can't operate, where central agencies cannot operate, and BSF has trouble policing the border. So the British, who sponsored the Muslim League in Dhaka in 1906, have now brought home Dhaka and Mamata Banerjee's Kolkata to their own country, across the country, not just the North and Midlands. The situation in the United Kingdom is extremely dire. And I wonder, by the time this inquiry is done, the Labour Party will be out of power. But if it is done before, they will certainly not be in government because the scandal will be far too great for them to cope with.
This is exactly why I wanted to have a conversation with you, Dr. Sen, about this issue of Baroness Casey's very detailed report. I want to come back to that report, but I want to mention why I wanted to discuss this with you, because this is not just about the dastardly violence against women and girls case in the UK. In fact, as you are pointing out, if one starts to connect the dots, it really becomes about subversion of British local politics by Pakistani elements using platforms, religious platforms in different cities, councils, and counties to really impact British foreign policy. I want to come back to and link it back to Baroness Casey's report. One of the most striking things, and we have discussed this in the past, but the numbers are now in front of us. In places where there are only 2%, 1% Pakistani population, there the cases in which Pakistani assailants were involved in grooming gang cases is high. More than 60% in some cases were Pakistani assailants, even though the population of Pakistanis in those areas were barely 1 or 2%. This shows organized criminality at a whole new level, Dr. Sen.
You see, there are white grooming gangs as well, but never has there been organized grooming across the country on this scale. And yes, they constitute almost 2/3 of all the grooming gangs, even in areas where their numbers are below 4%, 5%. Most alarmingly, there is a great deal of talk that London, which hasn't been investigated and which has a Pakistani Mirpuri mayor, is very reluctant to investigate grooming gangs. It has, in fact, almost certainly been a major phenomena in London involving Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, and some Somalis as well. But this has not been investigated. Once again, local elections are ignored by the wider public, fewer than 30, 35, 40% vote. So if you can organize the Muslim vote exactly as it is done across India, where Muslim voters are significant, you can seize the electoral process. So this actually is a coup d'etat of extraordinary significance to all democracies and a clarion call to impose compulsory voting with penalties for failure. I don't like the idea that people will have to vote for a particular party, but they should attend the polling booth even if they say, I don't want to vote for any of the candidates. None of the above. But they should be obliged, because otherwise, small, well armed, well organized minorities, often answering to foreign governments, can seize democracies through this kind of subterfuge. I fear it is not just local government. Their influence over national politics in the United Kingdom is very great. And I'm afraid none of the major political parties have clean hands. All of them have dragged their feet. And there is a reason for this, which is not just because of vote banks, because the vote banks are all Labour vote banks. The fear is, and I think this will have been conveyed by the intelligence services, that if you take significant action, imprison many people, arrest and deport them, and the British Secret Services are so stretched, they are likely to have said, we can't cope, because there are 40,000 people on the radar. And you cannot monitor 40,000 people. It is simply not possible. For example, the Muslim Stockport killer of, I think it was 6 girls and 8 more seriously injured, was on their radar. But in order to monitor this chap who is now in jail of Rwandan origin, they would have had to devote 4 or 5 people full time to shadow him. Now that is not possible for 40,000 people. So even people on the radar and considered dangerous are free to go about their business, and they can easily take to violence. And in my view, they can bring this country to the ground because there will be too many of them, which is exactly why the police have not sought to stop demonstrations of 100,000 people in London over Palestine. The London police does not number more than 30,000. The British Army is about 85,000, including all staff. How will they stop 100,000 demonstrators who take to violence? This is exactly the threat Mamata Banerjee has been holding over Delhi in the city of Calcutta. If you try to remove me and impose president's rule, I can produce 400,000 people in the Maidan to burn the city. This is the kind of unspoken threat in many British cities. The British establishment has lost control. They have lost control over their country in some very important ways. I'll tell you a little story which I worked out some years ago, and I wrote about this. The London mayor, Sadiq Khan, was one of the key representatives of terror accused, which as a lawyer he is entitled to be, because it is the principle of first in the taxi rank, you take whatever custom comes your way. But the terrorists had confidence in him to appoint him as their lawyer. And once the IRA had bombed the city of London, which generates 1/3 of British national revenues, Tony Blair's government rushed to settle the Irish problem with the so-called Friday Accord of power sharing. Once they felt that jihadi terrorists would attack London in ways that would cause chaos to Britain and the British economy, they decided that they would elect Sadiq Khan as the mayor, as a signal that this is their city and don't attack it. Which is why, in my view, with one exception of Lord Goldsmith, that is Emma Goldsmith's brother, the wife of Imran Khan, they have never put up a serious candidate. All the candidates the Tories have put up were guaranteed to lose, which tells me that all the political parties quietly backed Sadiq Khan in order to signal to the terrorists, do not attack his city. This is the scale of the problem Britain faces. But let me add, because I'm from India, the British have been the key sponsors of Islamic terrorism and Islamic fascism going back to the 19th century, right through after the First World War and in the 1930s. They were the principal patrons of these radical conservative monarchies which gave birth to Islamotterrorism, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all of these countries. The British and the French destroyed all attempts at secularism in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in order to empower these radical conservative monarchies which paid for terrorism. This was then taken over after the Second World War by the Americans. Islamic terrorism is a tool of foreign policy of the Anglo-Americans and the Americans most of all. The Americans were the sponsors of ISIS. They were sponsors of that vicious killer Zarqawi in Iraq. Obviously, we know that the American sponsors the Taliban. All of these terrorist groups have been used, most of all against Russia and India, and they have been used against Arab regimes they did not like. For example, ISIS, the Sunni terrorists, and Zarqawi was used against the pro-Iranian Shia government which came to power in Iraq after Saddam Hussein was overthrown. The ISIS terrorists, who are now in power and on very good terms with President Donald Trump, were used against Bashar al-Assad. So the terrorists remain a key asset of the Anglo-Americans, and this business of what is happening at home is a spin-off. They wanted to use the terrorists and radical Islam against China with the Uyghurs, but we know what the Chinese did. The Chinese embarked on a policy of genocide to curb this, and it is genocide what they're doing, which should not happen to any group of people for whatever reason. So the last bastion for the Anglo-Americans to use Islamic terror remains India. India is the one country where Islamic terrorism remains the trump card, which is used regularly. It is being used electorally through the Congress party, but much more is there which can be unleashed, from derailing trains, from massive demonstrations in Delhi, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Bombay, and they have had trial runs in Delhi already through the farmers' dispute and the anti-CAA to test the ground. So Islamoterrorism will be the final assault to remove an unwelcome government from power in Delhi and install a pliable asset in the Indian Parliament. All of this remains the goal of the Anglo-Americans, which is why it horrifies me that there are spokespersons and their friends in the United Kingdom who want very close ties with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is truly a perfidious government, and I hope Indian policymakers in private understand this. So Baroness Casey has much wider ramifications. What she has pointed out is specific to English regions and the British Parliament, but this is not the whole story. It is much, much bigger and much more dangerous for the outside world. Arabs who have secular pretensions, Indians, and other countries. But these chickens have now come home to roost in Britain. And I think the British Parliament really has lost control. And I am almost certain this national inquiry will be subverted. They will do everything to prevent swinging action against a community which is holding them hostage through their vote banks and through the fear of terror.
Now, Dr. Sen, this has great ramifications for British foreign policy around the world. We cannot, of course, forget that at the end of the day, Britain is an extremely powerful country militarily. It is, of course, a nuclear powered nation, and it has deep business interests around the world. And London, of course, perhaps the most important financial center of the world, apart from, of course, New York and Paris. But London has a particular importance in the world. Talk to me a little bit about what you just mentioned about electoral takeover. This has been hinted in the Baroness Casey report also, in county after county, how certain political parties, certain groups have actually taken over the entire electoral process, including through various measures, manipulating postal ballots, all kinds of things. And this is directly connected to the kind of people who then support local politicians. These are basically, gang lords and other sort of nefarious characters who are directly connected to these grooming gangs. So this has now become a very, very explosive story, and it goes to the very heart of why there is a fundamental collapse in many ways inside Britain.
Let me preface any further remarks I make by pointing out that these drug dealers and gangs are led by people of great political sophistication. These people understand politics, unlike, say, the British Hindus who are completely clueless, running around as headless chickens, hoping for an OBE, MBE, a knighthood and peerage. That's as far as their politics goes. But these people are led by sophisticated operators, and one of them was a professor at the university where you studied, the grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who is now in a jail in Paris. And there are academics who are jihadis basically in universities across the country who are serious people who understand the business. So the community's great asset, as we know in India, is that they vote as a unified bloc. They will vote 95% as one bloc, and they will vote in very high numbers. This is the source of their strength, as we know in Bengal, in Kerala, in Delhi, in UP, in Bihar. So this is the strength. Britain, actually, I'm afraid I must say, is not a significant military power. It barely has 80,000 soldiers who could barely fill Wembley Park. The entire British army could barely fill Wembley Park. Uh, their nuclear powers can only be operationalized with US consent. They have no foreign policy. Britain is a vassal state, and any serious commentator knows this. Britain is a vassal of the United States, like Germany, like Japan, like Australia, Canada. These are all vassals. They are allowed some latitude to protest and talk big for their domestic audience, but they do what they're told. So Britain's foreign policy is made in Washington. So this is not a problem. I'm afraid for anybody who cares, like you and me, Bengalis at some level, always think about Shakespeare and Byron, the poets and their literature, their great aesthetic achievements, is a source of great sorrow to see this happen. I've lived here a very long time, and I recall with nostalgia the sleepy rural towns of England, from the beautiful parts of the West Country where I lived, Laycock, Castlecoombe, the Lake District, Bath, Oxford, Cambridge, and these places are now in jeopardy. When I visit the towns in the West Country, change is coming. And these beautiful sleepy towns where there was not a single person on the streets on a Sunday afternoon, and there were beautiful brick houses and little streams that you walk into, and small little cafes and pubs, and these old shops with a heritage of hundreds of years. All of this is going. The British ruling class in all its cynicism, and they will have to lie on it. But unfortunately, the British people who have been led up the garden path will have few ways to escape it.
In conclusion, Dr. Sen, let me ask you two last questions. What is likely to happen? Because this Baroness Casey report has clearly exploded. British press is full of it. I think there were, major questions asked in Parliament. A national inquiry is promised. How that inquiry will pan out, nobody knows. But this story can no longer be hidden. So, what do you think will happen next? And number two, what does all of this mean for India? Because there are ramifications for India also if British policy can be impacted like this.
Let me put it very boldly. Uh, they are now caught in the horns of a dilemma, so to speak. The Labour Party in power has two choices. One is to subvert the national inquiry they have now promised by imposing terms of reference which Dominic Cummins is suggesting has already been agreed, and then having to suffer the opprobrium to have people really angry with them. That's one outcome. The other is to allow an explosive inquiry which will shake the establishment to its foundations and may invite great deal of Islamic violence and may oblige them to take action. So these are two parts of what is possible. One, they subvert the inquiry, and the other, they let it go the full hog and suffer a different kind of serious consequence. We wait and see. For India, it all depends on Delhi. What the British do and say is of virtually no consequence. We have certain things we want from them. For example, Rolls-Royce aero engines. We want their new laser technology to shoot down drones. All of these things. There are many specific things. And the trade treaty, as I've said on your program we have signed, is a very clever one. We have given very little, and we have ensured many protective devices for the adjustment which India will have to make. And when India has $8 and $10 trillion in its GDP, India can cope with much more open trade, and which I believe should happen. The problem for India is, psychological and colonial. We are very gullible people. We are very easily fooled and taken advantage of. And what we need is the hard cynicism which forces us to evaluate everything we do. And I do believe the current political dispensation has the capacity, the intellectual capacity, and the political will to assess and evaluate everything with ruthless clarity and without sentiment. And I mean our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, our External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, our National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, and there are others. So while they're in power, I am reasonably serene. The only thing I hope is happening, and I suspect it may well be, we need to make very careful plans of how to deal with simultaneous urban insurrection with the challenge at the border. Because I think that will be a compelling issue for the country to face. And already we have found the government was all at sea with just the farmers' dispute and allowed it to hammer the Delhi police, dishonor the capital and our flag. So government needs to draw up very careful plans of what kind of harsh action they are prepared to take if jihadis from abroad, including England and elsewhere, catalyze a revolt to outsmart and overthrow an elected government. This is what I think we should really be worrying about. Other than that, I'm reasonably comfortable. India has shown its mettle at the border, and as I said, we have leaders who understand the business.
I can't but let you go without asking you one humanitarian question, which we haven't discussed till now. What about the families of these girls who have suffered this abuse for years and years, Dr. Sen? Many of those voices are now coming out. In fact, at the end, in the Baroness Casey report, she writes about her own personal feelings through this journey and talks about how many families still live in great fear and oppression. Even though their cases have been tried, the assailants been given punishment, they've come out early, they continue to bully them, they continue to harass them, continue to make their lives miserable. What about them? I mean, surely we should also talk about these families. What about these hundreds and hundreds of families who face this?
You know, what has happened to them, these children in many cases, many cases, from vulnerable backgrounds, people in care, but middle class girls too. Words fail me. I suspect the ruling class is cynical. They engage in public hand-wringing, but politics rules for them. Politics is what matters for them. If they really cared about them, the lives of these young girls have been ruined anyway, and they've led terrible lives after the experiences they had to undergo. The minimum you could do is to offer adequate recompense for them to have a slightly better life. And I'm afraid money is what counts. But the way the British establishment has sought to evade responsibility towards the unjustly prosecuted and imprisoned postmasters who were accused of theft and robbery when none of it was true demonstrates that the British ruling class is morally bankrupt. They were very reluctant to compensate them, and even now, the issue of compensation has not been closed, though everything has been exposed and the courts have intervened, which means these women who are in many cases adults now, who should be compensated at the very minimum, is not going to happen. That's all that remains. Expressing sorrow for them is now irrelevant. They've already suffered what they've suffered, and they've grown up with this suffering, and your life is damaged. If you've been gang raped over weeks and months, what is left of your psyche? What is left of your emotional stability? And some of these women come on TV, and I'm astonished by their courage and the ability to speak about their experiences. And let me conclude with one tiny story of my own. Many decades ago, I had to talk to a person I knew who worked in a care home in the county of Buckinghamshire. And there, for the first time, I saw these young people in care, mostly people who are below the age of 12. And I spent the afternoon there with the person I was visiting. And I will never forget that I came out with such a heavy heart. One little girl came up to me and said, "Can I have your phone number? Can I have your phone number?" She was trying to make friends. She was trying to make friends. This is how vulnerable and tragic they are. And I have never forgotten that. And this was the kind of person who was gang raped and being treated like meat and passed around by these grotesque Pakistani men brought up in a culture which requires these women as lesser than animals. And some of them have said in court, it is permitted by our holy book. They have said in court, it is permitted by our holy book.
Dr. Sen, thanks very much indeed for your comments and detailed thoughts on this terrible, terrible story. No doubt, as days go by and the inquiry, if it happens, and when it happens, we will keep tracking what happens there and, of course, what happens to British politics after this major expose. For now, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it deeply. And, of course, for all of such conversations, always in depth, never dumbed down, all you have to do is press the bell icon and follow Global Order. We bring you lots and lots of these conversations, cutting edge from around the world, some of the best minds, only on Global Order. I'm Hindul Sengupta. Thanks very much for watching.
Thank you.